10 years ago, in a tiny, drafty apartment in Seattle, there was a smell that never left the air. It was a mix of cheap, bitter coffee and the sharp, chemical scent of oil paint. That apartment belonged to Claire and David. They had no furniture, just a mattress on the floor and a massive wooden easel that took up most of the living room. Claire was a painter. When she picked up a brush, the world disappeared. But the world is an expensive place to live in. While Claire painted, David worked. He didn't just work one job, he worked 3. He delivered newspapers at 4 a.m., washed dishes at a diner during the lunch rush, and stocked shelves at a grocery store until midnight. Every night, David would come home with swollen feet and hands that smelled like dish soap. He would walk over to Claire, look at her canvas, and his tired eyes would light up. "Claire," he would whisper, "this is the one. This is going to change everything." Claire would look at his exhausted face and feel a pang of guilt. "David, you're exhausted. Maybe I should get a job at the diner too. I can paint at night." But David would always shake his head. He would take her paint-stained hands in his and say, "No, the world has enough waitresses. It doesn't have enough artists like you. I'll handle the bills. You just give the world your vision." They were happy. They were broken in love happy. They shared single cans of soup and walked everywhere because they couldn't afford the bus. On her birthday, David couldn't buy her jewelry, so he spent a week's worth of lunch money on a single, high-quality tube of cerulean blue paint because he knew she had run out. Then came the rainy Tuesday that changed their lives. A small, local gallery owner had seen Claire's work through the window of a coffee shop where she had hung a small piece. He offered her a tiny spot in a weekend show. It wasn't much, but to them, it was everything. At the gallery that night, Claire stood in her only decent dress. David stood beside her, wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big, looking out of place among the wealthy art collectors in their silk scarves and expensive watches. A man approached them. His name was Julian, a powerful art critic known for making or breaking careers. He didn't look at David. He looked only at Claire's painting, then at Claire. "You have a gift," Julian said, his voice smooth as velvet. "But a diamond in the mud is still covered in mud. If you want to shine, you need to change your surroundings." He glanced at David's cheap suit and rough, dishwasher hands for a split second before looking away with a smirk. For the first time in her life, Claire felt a tiny, sharp spark of shame. She looked at David, and for a fleeting moment, he didn't look like her hero. He looked like a weight. Success is a funny thing. We think it's a door that opens, but for Claire, it was a wall that slowly started building between her and the life she once loved. A year passed. Claire was no longer painting in a drafty apartment. Julian, the critic, had become her mentor. He moved her into a bright, white studio in the trendy part of the city. Her paintings were selling for thousands of dollars. For the first time, she didn't have to check her bank account before buying groceries. She should have been happy. But as Claire's world grew bigger, David's world stayed the same. He still worked late shifts. He still came home with grease under his fingernails and tired eyes. He was still her biggest fan, but now his praise felt heavy. One evening, Claire was getting ready for a gala at a major museum. It was her big debut. She was wearing a dress that cost more than David made in a month. David came into the room, still in his work uniform. He looked at her and smiled, a genuine, proud smile. "You look like a dream, Claire. I'll go take a quick shower and get into my suit." Claire paused, her hand frozen on her pearl earring. She looked at David in the mirror. She saw his calloused hands. She saw the way he walked with a slight limp from standing all day. Then she thought of Julian and the elite crowd at the museum. She remembered Julian's words. "Image is everything, Claire. You're a brand now. Don't let anything drag that brand down." "David," she said, her voice small and tight. "Actually, maybe you should stay home tonight." The room went silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. David's smile didn't disappear. It just turned into something else, something sad. "Stay home. It's your big night, Claire. I've waited years for this." "I know," Claire said, not looking him in the eye. It's a very specific crowd. Very corporate. Julian thinks it's best if I present myself a certain way. You're so tired, David. You've been working so hard. Why don't you just order some good food and relax? She was lying. She knew it, and he knew it. She wasn't worried about his exhaustion. She was embarrassed by his reality. She didn't want to explain to the wealthy donors that the man beside her washed dishes for a living. David didn't argue. He never argued. He just nodded slowly. Right. The specific crowd. I get it. He walked over and placed a small, wrapped box on the vanity. I got you this. A little good luck charm. I'll be here when you get back. Claire went to the gala. She was the star of the show. She drank expensive champagne and laughed at jokes she didn't find funny. Everyone told her she was refined and sophisticated. But all night, her chest felt tight. When she got home late that night, the apartment was dark. David was asleep on the couch. She opened the small box he had left her. Inside was a keychain with a tiny, hand-carved wooden palette. On the back, he had carved, "To the girl who paints the world." Claire looked at the gift and felt a wave of coldness. Instead of feeling loved, she felt annoyed. She felt like David was a tether to a version of herself she was trying to kill. She didn't want to be the girl who paints the world. She wanted to be the woman who owned it. The gap wasn't a crack anymore. It was a canyon, and Claire was getting ready to jump to the other side alone. The next few months felt like a blur of white walls, expensive wine, and people who used words like provocative and texture. Claire's name was everywhere. She was no longer just an artist, she was an investment. One afternoon, Julian sat Claire down in her sun-drenched studio. He sipped an espresso and looked at her latest work. "You're on the verge of greatness, Claire," he said. "But your energy is still split. You spend your days in this high society world, and then you go back to that little apartment. It's holding you back. You can't be a queen if you're still living in the basement." Claire knew what he meant. He didn't have to say David's name. That evening, she went home. David had cooked a small dinner, just pasta and bread. He had set the table with a mismatched candle he'd found. He looked happy. He had finally saved enough money to quit one of his 3 jobs. "I can be home more now, Claire," he said, smiling. "We can actually have dinner together. We can talk like we used to." Claire looked at the pasta. She looked at the cheap candle. She thought about the penthouse apartment Julian had shown her earlier that day, the one that overlooked the entire city. "David," she said, her voice flat. "I'm moving out." David stopped eating. He didn't drop his fork. He just sat very still. "Moving out? To a bigger place? That's great. I'll start packing our things tonight." "No," Claire said, and this time she looked him right in the eyes. "I'm moving out. Alone. I think we've grown into different people, David. My life is moving at a speed you can't keep up with. And honestly, I don't think I want to keep up with yours anymore." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Claire had ever felt. David didn't cry. He didn't yell about the years he spent washing dishes until his skin peeled. He didn't remind her of the winter he went without a coat so she could buy more canvas. He just looked at his hands, the hands that were scarred and rough because of her. "Is this what you really want?" he asked quietly. "Or is this what they told you that you should want?" "It's what I need for my career," Claire snapped. She felt a surge of anger, but deep down, she knew it was actually a surge of cowardice. She needed to be angry so she wouldn't feel the soul-crushing guilt. "I see," David said. He stood up, walked to the closet, and pulled out his old duffel bag. "You don't need to move out, Claire. You're the one who can afford this place now. I'll go." As he packed his few belongings, Claire stood by the window, watching the rain. She expected to feel a sense of freedom. She expected to feel like a bird leaving a cage. When David reached the door, he paused. He didn't turn around. "I hope the view from the top is everything you thought it would be," he said. Then the door clicked shut. For the first time in years, the apartment was completely silent. No sound of David humming, no sound of him brewing coffee, no sound of his tired footsteps. Claire sat down at her easel and picked up a brush. She had everything she ever wanted. She had the fame, the money, and the right people around her. She began to paint, but for the first time, the canvas felt like a wall. She realized she had just traded her heart for a golden frame. 20 years. 20 years of fancy galas, glossy magazine covers, and white-walled galleries. Claire was now a name whispered in the halls of the great museums. She had the penthouse. She had the view. She had a husband, a wealthy architect who understood branding and networking. But Claire hadn't painted anything real in a decade. Her work had become a formula. She knew exactly which colors sold. She knew which strokes made the critics happy. Her art was no longer a window into her soul. It was just a high-end product. She felt like a hollow statue in a beautiful dress. One rainy afternoon, while wandering through a dusty, forgotten bookstore in a part of the city she usually avoided, Claire saw a familiar name on a thin spine. The Silence of the Brush by David Miller. Her heart hammered against her ribs. David. She hadn't heard that name in 2 decades. She pulled the book from the shelf. It was a collection of essays and short stories published 10 years ago. It hadn't been a bestseller. It was a quiet book for a loud world. She sat on a rickety stool in the back of the shop and began to read. The prose was like water, clear, honest, and heartbreaking. He wrote about a girl who used to paint with fire in her eyes. He wrote about the smell of cheap coffee and the way the light hit a small apartment in Seattle at 5 p.m. He wrote about a love that didn't need a gallery to exist. He didn't write about her with anger. He wrote about her with a kind of devastating pity. In the final chapter, he wrote, "I used to think that the greatest tragedy was being poor. I was wrong. The greatest tragedy is forgetting who you were when you were poor. We think we are climbing a mountain to find the sun, but sometimes we are just walking away from the only person who was willing to sit with us in the dark." Claire closed the book. The air in the bookstore felt thick. She realized that Julian and the critics hadn't discovered her. They had consumed her. They had taken the raw, bleeding heart of her art and polished it until it was dead. David hadn't been a weight. He had been the ground. And without the ground, she hadn't been flying. She had just been drifting. She went back to her penthouse that night. She looked at her latest masterpiece sitting on the easel, a cold, blue abstract piece worth $50,000. She picked up a palette knife, and for the first time in 20 years, she felt something real. She didn't paint. She scraped. She scraped away the layers of expensive paint until the raw canvas showed through. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She was a world-famous artist with 1 million followers and 1,000 friends. But she was also a woman who had traded a man who loved her for a crowd that merely applauded her. She reached into the back of a jewelry box and pulled out a small, tarnished keychain, a tiny wooden palette. On the back, the carving was faded but still there. "To the girl who paints the world." Claire began to cry. Not the soft, elegant cry of a movie star, but the ugly, shaking sob of a woman who had finally realized the price of her own success. She had the whole world now, but she had no one left to tell it to.